Welcome back to the channel, Tommy with Elevation Every Weekend. In this video, I'm going to give you my ride impressions of the Trek Roscoe 7 and let you know if it hits the mark. The 7 really is the entry point in the Trek Roscoe lineup. Yes, there is a Trek Roscoe 6 at a much cheaper price point of $11.99. That's not really the same bike compared to the others in the lineup, as it doesn't have 3 axles, nor does it have the modern standard of boost spacing. Whereas this Roscoe 7 does have modern bike spec at a reasonable entry price point. And that MSRP is $18.99. However, this bike has been on sale for quite some time at $16.49. Even though I always do recommend buying the best bike you can when you're shopping for one, and that's because most of the time it's typically more expensive to upgrade parts after the fact, especially if you're looking at the suspension fork. The Roscoe 7 still offers a reasonable price and spec for the newer mountain biker, or for a more casual rider who wants to enjoy or push their limits a little bit on the trail occasionally, but isn't really motivated by constant or excessively aggressive riding. Not that the bike can't handle that though. I did a video recently on the concept of capability versus performance in bikes, which I'll link down below if you want to check it out. The Trek Roscoe 7 is plenty capable, even if it doesn't have the performance of quite some of the more expensive versions. I recently had a chance to spend a couple days with this bike, so for starters, let's look at the spec, and then we'll move on to some ride footage and give you my impressions there. Although this particular bike was a size medium and was a little small for me, I was still able to ride it fairly comfortably on some trails and really get a feel for the bike. I find that Trek is better than most companies with their sizing, as this bike comes in 6 different size options, so getting a proper fit on the bike should be possible with minimal compromise. So again, before we get to that trail footage, let's go over the spec and the features of this bike. The frame is Trek's solid alpha gold aluminum frame, and it does have a threaded bottom bracket. It is a 140mm RockShox Recon silver fork. More details on this shortly. It features 29-inch wheels with Bontrager 2.6-inch XR4 tires. This is a tubeless ready bike. In my experience, if you buy a bike from a Trek store, they will automatically set the bike up tubeless, which I think is nice that Trek is doing this instead of being tubeless ready but shipping with tubes. However, this bike was purchased from a Trek authorized dealer, and they actually set the bike up with tubes, unfortunately. It is a 1x12 Dior drivetrain. These days, the lower end 12-speed Dior or SRAM NX drivetrains are actually quite good on performance, with a modest weight penalty over their more expensive options. This bike came with a Trans X 130mm dropper. This is essential kit for this type of bike, and it works well. The brakes are the ubiquitous Shimano MT200s. I've always found these brakes to be serviceable, and I've never had any complaints with them. They stopped well combined with the large aggressive tires, and this bike does have 180mm rotors front and rear, which are right size for this bike. Moving on to the geometry, this bike does have the right geo for a modern trail bike. It has a 65-degree head tube angle, a 73.1-degree seat tube angle, and 430mm chainstay length. The reach is relatively compact with 780mm wide bars, which a little surprisingly have a 31.8mm stem size, but it is at the entry level end of the spectrum. And even with the 2.6s on, there's plenty of tire clearance. You could probably even squeeze a 2.8 in the back, not that you'd want to. As for some of the aesthetic details, I actually really liked the bright multicolor scheme on this bike, but they do offer 2 other more muted color options. And I did find the paint scheme kind of interesting in that you can actually feel that speckled splatter effect that you can see on the frame. Overall, I found it to be a very good looking bike, if that is something that matters to you, but that's a subjective statement. The stated weight for this bike in size medium from Trek is 31.5 pounds. I didn't get a chance to actually weigh this one though, but it does have some additional accessories on it as well. So let's move on to some ride impressions on the trail. I was switching off riding this bike back to back with my Trek Pro Caliber Carbon XC race bike, so it was a really good contrast to feel the same trails on both of these bikes. If I had to offer one takeaway on how this bike rides in one sentence, I would say that the Roscoe plows through the trails. That may sound kind of like a criticism, but I actually find it to be a good thing, especially since this bike is targeted at newer riders. Of course, this bike is not particularly nimble or precise, and I really felt that coming off of a 25-pound XC carbon bike. At speed, it is a bit more difficult to hold tight single-track lines, especially when navigating trees and the terrain. But on the plus side, this bike really does roll through just about anything with little drama. So when you do get into a rough section of terrain, especially at speed, the Roscoe does not get upset by it, whereas my XC bike can at times. And again, this is a great confidence-inspiring aspect for newer riders. I have many thousands of miles on my 2015 Trek Stash, which is also a hardtail 29er, and that bike has a 120mm RockShox Recon fork as well. And back in 2015, it was more of a trail-focused hardtail. The Roscoe actually reminded me quite a bit of this older Stash, especially because I did have 2.6-inch Maxxis Minions on it at one point when I was really pushing that bike's limits on the trails out here in Colorado. I can say though that the 140mm RockShox RockShox Recon on the Roscoe is far superior than the Recon on the 2015 bike. So back to some specifics on the fork for just a moment. I found that the 140mm Recon works really well on this bike. 5 or especially 10 years ago, when you had a lower end fork on your mountain bike, like the Recon I had on my stash, they had some significant limitations and just really didn't work well for a lot of things. These days I've been finding that lower spec forks, like the RockShox Judy I used to have on my Trek Pro Caliber XC bike or the Recon Silver bike on this Roscoe, actually do a really respectable job in their overall performance. And what that means is they actually feel fairly plush, something many years ago was only obtained on the higher end forks. And they also have the fine-tune adjustment to be responsive to the trail. Really the only downside is they usually end up being really heavy. I recently replaced that RockShox Judy on my XC bike with a RockShox Reba, which is definitely a decent mid-range fork. And while it does perform slightly better, the main improvement was it's about 2 pounds lighter. As I mentioned earlier though, forks, especially in the mid and upper tier ranges, are expensive. If you can get a better fork on your bike by going up a level or two on the overall build of the bike, usually the fork upgrade by itself makes that cost difference worth it, and you'll usually get several other upgrades as well. Moving on to the tires, which are the Bontrager 2.6-inch XR4s. They were plenty tough for the terrain I tested them on, and the combination of good volume combined with the aggressive tread were also great in the rough stuff. They provided good comfort and epic traction, and most importantly did not slip on the rocks and roots that were present. The dropper seat post worked really well. It did its job keeping my weight low and over the back of the bike when appropriate. The operation of the drivetrain and the brakes were spot on whether I was climbing or descending. So despite its aggressive geo, heavier weight, and gnarly tires, I did find this bike actually pedals and climbs with no drama. And again, it doesn't exude that razor sharp handling that a lighter weight carbon bike would, but it certainly handles well enough. I had no problems with this bike on technical climbs or muscling it through technical features. The excellent traction really coming through in these areas. I would actually really like to get my hands on one of these bikes on my local Colorado trails that I'm used to riding, especially in a large size bike and a higher spec bike. I think it would be super fun and impressive on my home trails. So in conclusion and wrapping things up, let's circle back to the question I posed at the beginning of the video, and that is whether or not this bike hits the mark. And my resounding answer to this is yes. This bike was highly capable and confidence inspiring on everything I put it through. It pedals and handles well enough to be suitable to ride on easy XC trails, yet it really impressed with how stable and predictable it was on technical climbs and how settled it was on faster technical descents. This bike is priced at the entry-level trail hardtail market, and I think it really is a good match for those types of riders who may lack experience and are learning to ride more difficult trails. This bike can do all the essential trail bike things, but is easy to ride and most of all, forgiving. So if you have any questions, comments, or personal experience with the Roscoe series, drop that down in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, drop a like down below. It does really help out the channel. And if you want to continue to follow along with all of my MTB, fat, and adventure bike content, definitely subscribe to the channel. Lots more on the way, so stay tuned. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.